Good evening, everyone. I'm Jacqueline Howe. I'm with the Canadian Art Foundation, and I'd like to welcome you this evening to our very special program. Before I get started, though, I just want to give a really big thank you to Phil, Jed, and Sarah Lind, who have been supporting their continued support of the Anne Lynn Exchange Program. And without their support, it would not be possible. I'd also like to thank this evening Barbara Fisher and her team for their generous support in supplying us the facilities here tonight, and also for hosting a cocktail reception after Heidi's presentation. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to Richard Rhodes, our editor of Canadian Art, to introduce us to our guests this evening. Rick?
Okay, we'll see if we can make this extra formal for all 20 of us in the room here. But tonight we're delighted to host Heidi Zuckerman Jacobson, the Chief Executive Officer, Director, and Chief Curator of the Aspen Art Museum. Heidi arrived from Mexico City last night, and today plunged into a full slate of studio visits with artists Iris Hausler, Louis Jacob, Borins and Marman, Ed Pien, and Mike Alexier. Along the way, she also took in Mercer Union and the power plant. We thank her for her energy, her dedication on the windiest of November days. Tonight, Heidi will speak about her tenure at the Aspen Art Museum, which is a growing museum that has one of the most impressive curatorial programs of contemporary art in the US. Over the course of her career, Heidi has curated more than 100 exhibitions. In Aspen, her shows include artists such as Javier Tellez, Jeremy Deller, Friedrich Kunath, Jim Hodges, Mark Bradford, Mama Anderson, Kathy Wilkes, Mark Manders, Stephen Shore, and Ian Keir. Prior to her work at the Aspen Art Museum, Heidi was the Phyllis Wattis Matrix Curator at the University of California, Berkeley Art Museum. She was also Assistant Curator of 20th Century Art at the Jewish Museum in New York. I think her LinkedIn summary says it best when it simply describes her as a museum professional with specialization in global contemporary art. So thanks to Jed, Sarah, and Phil Lind, and the Canadian Art Foundation and Lind program, we can now add Toronto to that mix of global specialization. And thanks to the Justina M. Barnaky for making all of this tonight possible. Heidi, welcome.
So every time I hear that number, like more than 100 exhibitions, I kind of, remember how much effort that was. So I'm excited to be able to share a couple of things with you guys tonight, not more than 100 exhibitions, but a lot, because I'm just looking for the timer here on my phone. I really don't love being at lectures where the person only has like 6 slides. And you're like, can you just turn the slide? So I have a lot of images, and so we'll go through them and take them in, and happy to have questions as we go also. So before I start, I also just want to thank Anne and Marshall Webb, who have been my friends for a long time, and I've yet to have been to Toronto, so it's nice to be here in your community. And I'm a great fan of dialogue on contemporary art, and I'm really honored to have been invited to be an Anne Lind visiting scholar, or however that goes. Okay, so this is called Risk-Taking in Contemporary Art, but it could really be called anything. So it's a very selective survey of my practice over the last 20 years. And it starts with the first show that I ever curated, which was in 1994 at a space called Espace Montjoie in Paris. And this is the work of Doig Aitken. And one of the things that you'll see in my presentation is that my practice is defined by support of a group of artists that I've shown kind of repeatedly over time. And one of them is Doig. So you'll see Doig's work here in Paris, you'll see it again in Berkeley, you'll see it again in Aspen. And so I did use that as a filter for the work that I'm showing, to talk about that, because I really see the role of the museum curator as an advocate for artists, and I think that our role is to facilitate that communication. So, as I said, this is the first show that I ever curated, and it was intended to be a show of Doug Aitken, Diana Thader, and Katie Schimmert. And Diana Thader is a very good friend of mine, and she is incredibly difficult. And I learned something really important in that show, because this was a emerging gallery. They didn't have a lot of money, and Diana was completely inflexible on how she wanted her work presented. And I've had the opportunity to introduce her a couple of times for lectures and awards, and I always tell that story and she cringes every time I tell it. But the reason I tell that story is because I learned something really important, which is that it's good when artists are not flexible. Not to say that they should be intentionally difficult, but I think that a big part of what I learned is that artists do things for a reason. And if they're too flexible, then the reasons disappear, and then everything sort of falls apart. So I learned from Diana that my role is to advocate for artists. So Doug did this piece, and obviously it's a really early piece, because this show was in '94, and I think this piece is from '92, and he attached a homemade rocket he attached a camera, rather, to a homemade rocket, and he set it off in Southern California, and this footage is of that rocket flight. And so what we did was we installed 3 monitors, one on the ground, one kind of at eye height, which is over here, and then one up high, and that was the whole installation. So I can't remember why Katie Schimmert ended up not being in the show, but I ended up doing a show with her at the Berkeley Art Museum. So then this show was the next kind of significant show that I did. I had done other little projects in between, but we're skipping kind of to significant things, and this was based on my graduate thesis, which was about the nude body of the artist in video. And it was shown in these 3 venues you can see, and this was the first show that I did that traveled. And so I loved this idea that I could do a project that would be in New York, or the equivalent of New York, in San Francisco. And I grew up in the Bay Area, born in New York, grew up in the Bay Area, and then worked in New York, and then worked in the Bay Area. So there are these cyclical things. And then it traveled to Mexico City as well. So you can see the list of artists: Vito Acconci, Scott Cohen, Cheryl Donegan, Peter Land. There were 4 male artists and 4 female artists. Paul McCarthy, Alex Pearlstein, Carol Schumann, and Hannah Wilkie. Oh, sorry, I'll get this right. Okay. And so you can see some of the work here. So my premise of my thesis was that every artist who works with video at some point turns the camera on their nude body. Why? It's hard to say, except for perhaps the easiest subject is yourself, and being nude is the most essential way of working. And it turned out that there was a real gendered representation, and so the men had humor, the women were totally serious. The women were all beautiful, the men were largely not as attractive. The women all did things to themselves. The men all did things that were external. And the exception that proved the rule was Matthew Barney, who was serious and handsome and did things to himself. So then another show to skip was a show called American Dreamin'. And this was a show that was about what the ideals that America was founded on, what they had become at the time of 1996, which was leading up to the election of then Bill Clinton as the president of the U.S. But the country had really denigrated to being about guns and cars and church. So this show, was about that. So this is a work by Fred Tomaselli here. You'll see Fred Tomaselli's work come back in my presentation. The work on the right is a work by Tom Sachs, who I have a project up with right now also. This headphones were actually my husband's band at the time that played out on the street. So, and then Kim Jones, Lutz Bacher, So I am really interested in art that has an opinion. I think that the curator is in a position of privilege in that, particularly if you work in a museum, in that you have the opportunity to present work to a really broad-based audience, many of whom are not necessarily art people. And so with that comes a certain amount of responsibility, and I take a real sort of moralistic perspective to that. At the Aspen Art Museum, I don't show any work or allow any work to be shown that I wouldn't let my kids see. Not that we exhibit any form of censorship, but I just think that it's great that all sorts of work gets made. But we raise money from people to show work in our institution, and I want to be able to always say, yeah, you can come and see it, and you can bring your family. So with that, I like to show work that has a perspective. So this was a space, my husband had a company, a construction building company in New York. The space was really big. He had a rehearsal space for his band and other bands downstairs, and he said, do you want the front of the space to show art in? Because we don't really need it. And I said, great. So it was a storefront on the Lower East Side. It had windows, and it was a largely immigrant community. And so I wanted to use those windows to let people see the art from the exterior and decide if they wanted to come in. And interestingly, and I'll talk about this, we're doing a new building in Aspen with Shigeru Bon, and Shigeru's done a glass facade on part of the building where you can stand outside and look in and see if you feel comfortable enough to go in. So this is a French artist named Michel Blasi. This was based on a project that he had done at Musée d'Art Moderne in Paris, and I called him up, and said, I have a little space in New York, and would you like to come and show? So the fact that I could get a version of a museum show from Paris to come to our little teeny space on the Lower East Side was really exciting for me. And I learned that artists really like to work with people that want to work with them, particularly if you're earnest, I guess, in your approach. So what he did was create these sculptures out of cotton and put things in them that seemed like they were at the end of their life. So birdseed, popcorn, and then he took also vegetables like onions, and we would water them. My husband would be on the phone with his clients, and he'd be watering these things, all day long for a month, and they came back to life. So it was really kind of this great project because particularly for people that lived in the neighborhood, as they would walk by, at first it looked like nothing. It looked like all this minimal sculpture. And then, it came to life, which was really exciting. It was all bright, and very green. And then, of course, everything died. So it's also a little bit of a metaphor for life itself, right? It starts as nothing, becomes something, and then it goes back to nothing. So this was actually the last project that I did when I was at the Jewish Museum. And the Jewish Museum was my first museum job. And my boss at the time had been the chief curator since the year that I was born. And the 3 senior curators and the director there had over 100 years of experience at the museum between them. So coming in as a young curator, it was a very interesting thing to navigate how to actually get my exhibitions on the schedule. And it was hard. So what I decided to do was to see if I could do a show in the collateral spaces around the museum that no one else wanted. So I made friends with the maintenance people and said, take me everywhere, and came up with a list of spaces of, where I thought I could show work. So one of the things they showed me were the windows on Fifth Avenue, and I had Olafur Eliasson come, and he had never done a project in the U.S. before, and took him to see the windows on Fifth Avenue, and he was very polite, and he said, oh, that's nice, Heidi. What's this? And I said, what are you looking at? And he said, these grates that are surrounding the museum. And I said, oh, I don't know. I'd been there in like 5 years. I said, I don't know what they are. So it turns out, there was basically like a moat around the museum, and he said, can I show my work there? So he installed 10 floodlights with yellow filters and 2 fog machines, and got the staff to install them. And turns out there was a wind tunnel in that moat, so all the fog was blowing off on 92nd Street, and so they had to build a wall at the last minute. And but this is Olafur Eliasson's first project in the U.S., and when it was done, it was really great. And the neighbors on Fifth Avenue kept calling the police because they thought the building was on fire. So we had to go and get a circus permit, and so they shut us down for a couple days, and then it came back. But this is, I was really fortunate when I was in New York because I got to hire an amazing designer from the Museum of Modern Art named Jerry Neuner, who would basically moonlight for me, and an amazing designer, graphic designer named Sue Koch from the Met, who also moonlit for me, because their jobs were very specific at their institutions, and for me, they got to be a little more innovative. So Sue Koch did this graphic, which I didn't actually say. This show is called Light Times 8, the Hanukkah Project. I called it the Hanukkah Project. The marketing people called it Light Times 8. But Hanukkah is a Jewish holiday where every day for 8 days you light a candle. So this is 8 artists, all video projection and light sculpture. And so this was a way that I figured out how to merge contemporary art and the mission of the Jewish Museum. So every night, for one night, a new artwork was added until all 8 were on, and then it stayed on for the month. So the first night was Olafur Eliasson. So here on the street, she did the graphics. These are the names of the 8 artists, like the candles. And then the shaft was the text panel. So it's like a Hanukkah lamp or a menorah. So the second night, this was Jessica Bronson, and she did a video projection on the doors of the museum. And then the next night was Jorge Pardo, which was this chandelier of sorts, which was in the elevator lobby. And then the next night was Felix Gonzalez Torres, and this is kind of amazing because that's the donor wall. So I was arguing that it actually lit up the donor wall, and they were like, actually, Heidi, it's blocking the donor wall. But at that point, I had already gotten my job at Berkeley, and they're like, just get her out of here. Let her do whatever she wants. So here you can see the text panel again, and there's a view playing into the Diana Thader installation, which was in the gallery there. And then this was Christoph Wojcicki, which was upstairs. This is the other Diana Thader. And then I'm not showing you the Eleanor Antin and the Dan Flavin. So it was a really great way to do this show. Only about half those artists are Jewish. And that was the end of my time at the Berkeley Art Museum. The end of my time at the Jewish Museum. So then I went out to the Berkeley Art Museum, largely because what I wanted to do was kind of a fusion of what I had done at the Jewish Museum, which was work with people that weren't necessarily anticipating a contemporary art experience when they came to the museum, and merge that with the more avant-garde curating that I had done in Paris and Mexico City and around. As Richard said, I was a Phyllis Wattis Matrix curator, and when I went to Berkeley, just like when I went to Aspen, I like to ask people what the museum does well. I'd like to ask people what their expectations are and what their experiences have been as a way of evaluating what I should do going forward. So at the time that I came to Berkeley, I kept asking people, what do you know about the Matrix program? And people thought it had something to do with that Keanu Reeves movie, which was, out at the time, The Matrix, or they knew about this homeless program in San Francisco. And everyone who did know about the Matrix program never called it the Matrix program. They always called it the Matrix Gallery. And so what I realized was that people thought that the Matrix program could only exist in this one gallery that it had been sort of ghettoized into in the space of the Berkeley Art Museum. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to do my first show, and I'm going to leave the Matrix Gallery empty, and I'm going to do my show out on the terraces around the museum. And the terraces around the museum were so underused that a local artist who was a homeless guy had been using it as his painting studio and had more than 250 paintings hidden up there, and hidden in plain sight, let's just say. Okay, so I asked Tobias Rehberger to do a project, and he came up with this project called Sunny Side Up. And what it was basically is 3 planters that were on 3 different levels of the museum. And he wanted to do these curved structures. And I knew that when you come into a new institution, that's when you have all your political capital. And so I wanted to use it to the best of my ability. And so I wanted to do a project that would really stretch the staff and really set the tone for the ambitious nature of the program that I wanted to put forward. So I dealt with the chief preparator at the time, and he said, no, you can't do bent wood structures. And I said, we can, and he said, you can't. And I said, okay, if you can't do it, I'll ask my husband. He was like, figured it out the next day. So I said, okay. And then he said, well, you can't have soil up there, it'll be too heavy. And, I said, well, let's call the local planting company. So they ended up coming with a soil mixture that they called the matrix mix, which was high in nutrients and low in weight, so that it could, because these terraces were cantilevered. So Tobias's idea was these 3 planters. The exterior was the highest level of plants, and then there was a middle layer, which was, mid-height, and then the lowest level around the grassy center, which was supposed to be like the yolk of the egg, were plants that you could pick and eat together. So things that tasted good, like chilies and cantaloupe and strawberries and mint. So you can see, this is from above. So the strawberries and mints are on this first one, which has bamboo around it, and then the next one had the chilies and the mint. And so the plants grew. And we collaborated with the local botanical garden. They sent people over to water every day, check on the plants. And then, of course, eventually the plants died. So you can see this kind of patterning with the Michel Blasi, and being interested in making art out of non-traditional materials is something that you see a lot in my practice. And it was interesting because I had Lawrence Weschler come and speak with me on the opening of the museum. And he talked a lot about the ethereal nature of art and how it occurs sometimes in your brain rather than in what you see, and that the objects are secondary to the experience, which is something we feel and know. And there were a bunch of really angry graduate students from Berkeley who could really only focus on the tangible object and, and what it meant. And so what I tried to do with this initial exhibition was, to set the stage for the future, not just in its location, not just in its content, but also in its intention. So then another project that I did there was with Wolfgang Leib, and this is called Pollen from Pine. And so this was all pollen that he had collected in the Black Forests of Germany. And the collection of pollen takes a really, really long time. So to do this show, this is about 6 years worth of very therapeutic, very meditative processes in collecting the pollen. And so this is another show that was not in the Matrix Gallery. It was in a different gallery, and the pollen just really glowed. And so another thing that I'm interested in as part of my practice is the shamanistic elements to making art, and this idea of alchemy and how art can take something that was nothing and make it into something. And I'll talk about that a little bit in another show that I did, because also I think some of the beauty in art is when it doesn't work, because there is that inherent knowledge of failure in the production of art. So then when it does work, that alchemical transformation is just so exciting, and that's what we look for, is that inherent possibility. So I'm not really going in chronological order. So this was actually the third show that I did at Berkeley. So the first one was Tobias Rehberger, the second one was Katie Schimmert, and then the third one was Teresita Fernandez. And I show this work, I have a project up with Teresita right now, but I show this work because Teresita told me what she wanted to do. We commissioned a lot of work at Berkeley and at Aspen too. And so she said she wanted to create these pools where when you looked down into them, you would feel like you were looking down all the way into the earth. And so she wanted the space to also have that feeling, like the circularity of space, of water, of infinite possibility. And so I wrote my essay about what she said the work was going to do. And then the work showed up, and it didn't do that, and she didn't paint the walls. And I learned another really important lesson, which is don't write your essay in advance. But really what I learned is that what I want to do as a curator is to empower artists to try new things and to make our space into a laboratory. And in a laboratory, not everything is successful. Some experiments fail. And the couple of times when I've done projects with artists, and it's not to say that the whole show was a failure, but what was intending to happen didn't happen. And so there's that moment of sort of frustration or sadness or disappointment. And then that artist, the next project that they've done has been amazing. So if I didn't give them the space and the resources to create this project, then they couldn't have had like this breakthrough. So it wasn't clear at the time that these shows were breakthrough shows. It was just clear that they weren't what we had hoped that they would be. But then the next projects have been amazing, and then their work's gone on to just be totally incredible since then. So what I learned is the artistic practice is not a known one, it's a quixotic one, and even when it doesn't go the way you want it to go, it's usually what's supposed to happen. So you have on the cover of your Canadian art, Peter Doig. I did Peter Doig's first one-person museum exhibition in the United States, and he continues to be a friend and someone that I work closely with. And so this is his show, and I show this because I had an idea in my mind of how this show should be installed, and I had it all laid out when Peter arrived, and he came and he looked at the show and he kind of nodded his head and he said, do you think we could maybe try moving this one over there? And I was like, yeah, sure. And he said, and do you think we could move like this one, over there? And yeah, sure. And can we move this one over there? Before I knew it, he had rearranged the whole show. And it was really different than what I would have done. And I realized that actually it didn't really matter if I did it or he did it. And so that was, I guess, another learning experience. Sometimes it does matter, and I do have to do it, and I'll talk about that in some other exhibitions. But in that exhibition, it really didn't matter, and I learned more about his work from the way that he wanted to install it than I would have from the way that I wanted to install it. And in this instance, I had done the checklist, and so it made sense that he would do the installation. I wouldn't have let him do the checklist and do the installation because then you don't need a curator. But in terms of installing the show, then it made sense to have him do it. So this was a project with Doug Aitken. You saw the project in Paris. So this is the project that we did in Berkeley. It was called Into the Sun. And this was by far the most complex installation that our crew at the museum had done at the time. We basically had to build a whole film production space inside of the museum. This was a project that was based on Bollywood, the film industry in New Delhi, and India in general. So the front was a door, so it's kind of like a light well, so you walked in this way, and then you went through the wall into the space. And the space was covered with canvas walls and red earth on the floor. So it was like a recreation of the sound stages where these films were made. And this is a 7 channel video projection and thousands of images. It's actually all still images. So Doug, one of the things he's really interested in is speed and how we kind of live with speed, how we control it, manipulate it, exist within it. And so the Bollywood film industry goes basically 24 hours a day. They're making films 24 hours a day. People are starring in 6 or 8 films at the same time. And so the speed of production is just, almost incomprehensible. So what Doug did was he went there and he shot thousands of photographs, still photographs, because he was trying to then slow down or change the pace of what was happening anyway. And then he animated those still photographs. So he created something which had its own inherent speed, and then transcribed it with his own sense of motion. So, and then he worked with a really great sound artist, and they made a soundtrack which was inspired by Bollywood as well. So it was really incredible to be in that space because between the canvas and the sand, it was really hot, and all the video projectors, and so it kind of simulated that environment of being in India at the time as well. So I was interested in trying to play with the structure of the Matrix program as well. I was told some things when I got there. Matrix shows are only one-person shows, and they're all in this one gallery, and they're up for the same period of time. So I came up with a couple of different ways, which I've already alluded to, plus others to try and subvert that in a way. So I decided to do something called mini Matrix, which were these 4 mini shows. And I invited some curators to do some of them, and I did one myself with Carithwin Evans. And so this show was basically 1 minute and 42 seconds long. So Carithwin Evans is a British artist. One of the things that he does is work with fireworks. And so this was a Situationist quote, which says, "Take your desires for reality." So it was one Sunday afternoon. We had an opening. The gathering of people for the exhibition was longer than the exhibition itself. So it burned off, "Take your desires for reality," and that was the end of the exhibition. He did DJ a whole soundtrack, which we played for about an hour in advance of the lighting of the fireworks. So as part of Macromatrix, Macromatrix was sort of a code name for like a group show, but it was really 3 simultaneous one-person projects kind of packaged together under this Macromatrix idea. And this was a project with Saigao Cheng. And this was a piece that I had seen in Yokohama at the Triennial, and it's basically indoor fireworks and 9 incredibly high-tech Japanese massage chairs. So the idea is that you would lay in these massage chairs and, get this incredible massage while you would be looking at these indoor fireworks. So this piece was incredibly popular. People loved it, and in fact, our security staff used to come in early in the morning so they could sit in the massage chairs before the exhibition opened. So this was a project with Julie Meritou. This was her, I didn't actually tell you this, but one of the things that my career is based on is giving artists their first one-person museum exhibition. So many of the artists that I've already shown you, these were their first one-person museum exhibitions, and I should have indicated that, but this is Julie Meritou's first one-person museum exhibition. Interestingly, when I was in her studio, she explained the way that she works. These works are very much about mapping, but they're also filled with all these characters. And the characters are interacting with each other throughout the process of these paintings. And sometimes they're warriors, and sometimes they're religious people who are praying. If they're, a sort of a U shape, those are people praying. So they're doing different things, and they're the same characters that exist again and again in these different paintings. And when we installed the show, this painting she wanted to have lifted up. She wanted to be sort of like in a chapel, where at the very end, the stained glass is up high, so you get this reverent relationship to the artwork. And I think I just want to make sure I have this in here. Yeah. So that notion of the sort of reverence in art and the representation of religious notions then became an exhibition that I did at the Aspen Art Museum later, and I put Julie in it, and I can talk more about that when we get to it. But this is just an installation of her work. She made all new work for her exhibition at the Berkeley Art Museum, and it was great to be able to show both the paintings and the drawings. People hadn't really seen the drawings at that time, and so that was kind of a revelation for people as well. So then I was able to do a proper group exhibition because I just decided I had been there long enough and I should just go ahead and do it. And quite a few of the artists here I've subsequently done solo projects with: Mama Anderson, Amelie von Wolfen, and Wilhelm Sosnol. So this group exhibition was the first time that Wilhelm Sosnol's work had been seen in the United States. And these are his paintings here, all along the wall there. And these are the Mama Anderson works over here. Amy Cutler, this is Amelie von Wolfen, and Aaron Morse. So here's the Mama Anderson work. Mama Anderson is a Swedish painter, and there are always unexpected things happening in her paintings. So this is, you can see an exterior landscape with people bending down and clearly looking for something, but then there's like a pullback, and there's another landscape happening over here. So her works really pose more questions than they answer. And then this is the work of Amelie von Wolfen, who at the time was making these very large-scale collage works. So she would take an element out of a magazine or something. Here you see a surfer with the sun setting, but then she painted this entire landscape around it and added these different elements. So another sort of fusion of the real and the imagined, the hand-painted and the technologically reproduced. So then I had done this project with Mark Manders, who is a Dutch artist, who the show is called The Absence of Mark Manders, and Mark Manders had created a character named Mark Manders in all capital letters, who's not him, and Mark Manders, makes the work, and he created a super moment, which was in 1986, and he said that all of his work was created in that super moment. And so he also has been working since that super moment on a project called Self-Portrait as a Building. And so every single piece that he makes has to be able to inhabit his building. So the work is very complex. It has a lot of personal ideology to it. And I did a recent show with him that I'll show you pictures of, and what I wrote for that catalog was a field guide to the work of Mark Manders. And he represented Holland this year in the Venice Biennale and did a kind of variation of, so the text that I wrote, that field guide, informed then the catalog that he did this year. So Mark has a variety of things that occur again and again, these writing machines like this that you see in the back, these core-eye figures, which are neither male or female, they're sort of both and neither. He's really focused, obviously, on this notion of time because of the super moment. And so he would say that these are the same figure, but just separated by that. So, what happens in that moment? And I'm really interested in that moment because it's in that moment that there's all the possibility for transcendence, right? What happened before no longer exists. What's going to happen hasn't yet happened. And so it's in that moment that all the possibility lies. He's also really interested in scale, and so often things are slightly reduced. So this work, like the couch, he makes everything. So it doesn't matter if it's fabric or wood or metal. If he makes the newspapers that he puts in his work because he can't have anything from the outside world in his architecture. So everything has to be made. So the newspapers that he makes, the photographs are all photographs of dust in his studio. And so they're things that are to a different scale. So many things are at 97% scale or 84% scale. So they're just small enough that they feel a little bit odd or disconcerting, but they're not small enough that they seem small. So I left Berkeley and went to the Aspen Art Museum. And I went to the Aspen Art Museum because I felt like I had already curated 41-person exhibitions at the Berkeley Art Museum, many of them by artists who had never had a one-person museum show or never in the US, Mark Manders, most of these people that I showed you tonight. And what I realized about myself is that I'm really a curator of my generation. And I have been good at finding artists before they really become very well known. And I thought that, there's a time lifespan on that, and that, eventually there'll be people that will be better at finding the next artist than I am. And so I thought I should expand my repertoire and become a museum director who's still the chief curator. So I still curate about 90% of the exhibitions at the Aspen Art Museum. And I still think that's true. I have acquired works for museums, but I'm not really a collections curator. I have done projects that I've worked on for, a year and a half or 2 years, but I really don't do large-scale survey exhibitions, that take 3 years, 4 years, 6 years to work on. That's not really what I do. What I really do is commission work, advocate for artists, collaborate, etc. So when I came to Berkeley, I rewrote with the board the mission and vision of the institution to focus on contemporary art. So all of our exhibitions focus on or fall into one of three categories. First, one-person museum exhibitions, because I was like, I already know how to do that, I'm good at that. One-person exhibitions by well-known artists, but an unknown body of work, or or group exhibitions on a salient topic in contemporary society. So again, with my first major show, I wanted to kind of set the bar high and make it clear that, things were new, and to appropriately set expectations in that way. So my first real show was a very small show with Simon Evans, and that was his first one-person museum exhibitions. But my first major show was with Yutaka Sone. And Yutaka Sone is a Japanese artist who now lives in LA, and he had rolled these dice down the steps of the Opera House in Sydney. And I thought, you know what, we should roll these dice down the super pipe at Buttermilk Mountain, which is where the X Games are. And so I went and met, and then also when I came to Aspen, I noticed that people had these lift tickets hanging off their jackets, and they had a very generic alpine landscape. And I thought, well, that's a wasted space. We should commission artists to make works for the lift tickets. So I set up a conversation with the Aspen Skiing Company, and I went over there, and I pitched this idea that we should have this artist roll these dice down the super pipe at Buttermilk Mountain, and by the way, they should let me put art on all the lift tickets. So amazingly, they said yes, and we have this incredible partnership. So this is Yutaka's painting of what the dice would do, right? Fly all over the place. Well, if you've met Yutaka, he's an incredibly exuberant person. The dice didn't do that, but they did do this. And so they got kind of into it at the ski company, and so they built this attachment for one of their snowcats, which you can see here. And because we wanted to helicopter the dice from the museum to the mountain, and then I found out like 2 days before when the sheriff got a hold of the idea that they don't allow helicopters in Aspen unless it's like for emergency health transport. So 48 hours before, we had to come up with an alternative. But the snowcat worked pretty well, and the dice, we did a couple of tests. They're covered in P-Tex, which is the material on the bottom of skis that makes skis slide. And so they were, did I say 9 feet by 9 feet by 9 feet? And, so they rolled down the hill, and we had tons of people lining the top of the super pipe, and they only rolled about halfway down. And then the most remarkable thing, all these kids that had been standing on the top of the super pipe slid down, and they started tearing the P-Tex off the dice because it started to kind of come off as they rolled. And then they would climb back up, and they were using the P-Tex as slides. So they were sliding down the super pipe, and then they also came and they were pushing the dice down. And so it became this incredibly performative, community-based activity, which was so much better than if the dice had gone down and, rolled into the crowd or something like that. So this was the first lift ticket. And Yutaka made this painting, and we put it on the lift ticket. And we've now, for 8 years, have been working with the lift ticket. And I had gone to a dinner in Dallas for Peter Doig, and was seated next to him. And he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "We're going to put Yutaka's image, on a lift ticket this year." And he goes, "I want to do that." And I was like, "Okay." So then Peter did the next year, and then Karen Klimnick did the year after, and then we did Jim Hodges and Mama Anderson and Carla Klein, and this year we have Mark Bradford. Last year we had Mark Grosjean. So it's been a really interesting project, and we've always tried to do these on-mountain projects when it's been, appropriate as well. But I came up with this idea of art in unexpected places, and that goes through our whole program, including doing programs every Monday in the local jail for what they call the guests, because our whole idea is, bringing art to the people in, new and unexpected ways. And so if the people can't come to the art, then we have to bring the art to the people. So we're in all the senior citizens' homes, the jail, all the schools, et cetera. So Doug is really known as a video maker, and as a sculptor, or at least he was at the time. And Doug had gotten the Aldrich Prize. And I said, "Doug," and that came with an exhibition, and I said, "You should do an exhibition of your photography." And he's like, "Oh, no, no one knows anything about my photography. You have to remember, how much time has passed since then." And I said, "Well, that's what you should do." Well, they didn't want to do that. So when I got the job at Berkeley, I called Doug right away, and I said, "Can I do an exhibition of your photography?" And he said, "Sure." And then sent me all these images, many of which had never been printed before, so like thousands of images. So I spent all this time going through the images and putting them into different categories. And then I went to LA and sat down with Doug and I said, okay, so this is what you're doing. You do this kind of work, you do this kind of work, you do this kind of work. You know, this is how the things fall out. And he was like silent. And I said, you know, what? And he said, Heidi, I had no idea that my work was really exploring these different areas in a repeated fashion. And then that was like another aha moment for me, which is that artists don't always necessarily know exactly what they're doing, and they do need curators sometimes. So this show was then divided into these different categories, which explored landscape, these blank billboards, images of speed, desolation, you know, isolation in the urban environment. So in addition to using the space inside our current museum, we also do things, as I said, on the mountain, but also out on the grounds of the museum. So Pedro Reyes is a Mexican artist based in Mexico City, and he's really amazing. Recent projects have included collecting all these guns in Mexico City and melting them down and turning them into instruments, and you know, having people play them in these concerts. He did this great project at Documenta, which was like a medical healing facility based on art, and you could go in and get like a voodoo doll made of, like, you know, your ex-boyfriend or, you know, something like that. It was all like using art for cleansing, because we're all also obviously drawn to art for all sorts of reasons, some of which are social emotional. So that was a clinic to address those social emotional needs. But what he did here in Aspen, or there in Aspen, was this idea of recycling. So this is based on the Japanese model of recycling, and so you could come and drop off things that you didn't need anymore, and you could take away things that you did need. And so we worked with the local refuse center. It's not called a dump anymore. And they gave us all this corrugated cardboard, which were in these very large blocks, and that created this interior structure. And then he found all these plastic bins in Mexico and then created this form. And interestingly, when we installed it at first, the public really hated it. They thought it was kind of an eyesore. It's really large. It's obviously really colorful. It feels very non-organic in a very natural environment. But then when people realized its utilitarian properties, then the community really embraced it and used it. So I referenced being in Julie Maritu's studio and having this kind of epiphanous thought. And I was looking at this painting of Julie's, and I don't know why, but, and her partner Jessica was there too, and I suddenly said, you know, what do you think about the role of God in your art? And there was silence at first, because it's like, what an embarrassing question, and how like inappropriate and uncool to ask something like that. And then she said, yeah, totally, that's what all those orbs are, you know, at the top of my paintings. So here you can kind of see there's like an orb, and she said that's what's controlling all the activity and action in my paintings. So I started to ask a couple of other artists about it, and so this show is called Belief and Doubt, and it's not a show about religion at all. It's really about this idea of what we believe in and what we don't, and you know, how we function within what we know. And I had recently lost a really close friend of mine, and it just changed the way I understood the world. Like a bunch of things happened afterwards that are not explainable under the system of logic that I had used prior to that. And so I started to think about how we think we understand the world, and then when there's like a fusion, and there's a possibility that maybe we don't actually know everything that we think we know, or maybe things don't necessarily exist exactly in the same way that we think that they do, what that means. And so art is very much about that possibility. So this is Julie's work, and then this, sorry, I can't remember every name today. So in the back there you see Adam Jezusko, and he had done this project called the God Lookalike Contest, where he put an ad in papers in London, and he asked people who thought they looked like God to send him their pictures, and it's so amazing. the most amazing piece. So that was in the show too. So then I did this show, which is called Now You See It, and this show is about what I'm talking about. This idea of the alchemical possibilities of art and the inherent notion of failure. And so all the works in this show somehow address that notion of what art is and how we know it's art and why we think it's art and what we think then it means because of that. So this is a Felix Gonzalez Torres. Oops, sorry. This is what's confusing me. I can see the next slide. This is a Felix Gonzalez Torres blue bead curtain that you had to walk through. And so it was like it was water. So as you walked through, it was like a physical cleansing kind of that created a different psychic space for the viewer as you went into it. This is a Wolfgang Leib milkstone on the ground and Walid Beshti photograms that are made just with light. The way that he makes them is that he goes into the dark room and he takes photographic paper and it's in total darkness and he folds them up and then he exposes them to light. So there's this whole kind of chance. And of course, there's also, with that chance, there's the possibility of something amazing. And there's also, of course, the extreme knowledge of the potential of failure. Here's a Felix Gonzalez Torres light piece. There's a Rudolf Stingel insulation carved piece, a Tom Friedman 2x4 that's painted exactly like a 2x4. And then I didn't show it here because there isn't really anything to see, but I also had Tom Friedman's 1,000 Hours of Staring. And it's the most incredible piece. It's now in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And Tom stared at that work for 1,000 hours. And so, of course, you get people like, it's a white piece of paper. And it's like, no, it's not. It's more than that. And it's more than that because he stared at it for 1,000 hours. It's like, well, did he really stare at it for 1,000 hours? Well, you have to have that suspension of disbelief in it. But if you really look at it and you're looking for what it has in it, then of course you bring your own kind of energy and hope to it as well. And so then it responds as well by giving you back that kind of energy too. So this is a project with Jim Hodges. It's called You Will See These Things. Now, again, this is not the show that I expected to get. Jim usually works in a very kind of ethereal way. His work is very much about poetry and the sublime, but communicated through all sorts of images that both convey and are very fragile. And but right before the show happened, Jim's grandmother died, and Jim's very close to his mother and his grandmother. And so he made this incredibly dark work. And basically, this was like a black box, a couple of black boxes that were created out of wood with these pieces that you would turn to collapse it into the actual form. And then there was a gold leafed tube. He asked if he could drill a hole through the floor and through the ceiling. And so this was a tube that went from the exterior of the building through into here, the gallery, and you could be there and get air from outside. So it's like a life support structure. And this show was not particularly popular. It was a super tough show. The wooden box came kind of out into the space, into the lobby. You had to walk on it to get in. It was very precarious. I mean, it was about losing your way and being in a very, very dark place through grief. And then looking for, what your self-sustaining life force was. And so it wasn't what I expected, but it was a really important show for Jim. And then after this, I don't know that he's ever shown this work again, but he made these other boxes, these other rooms, which have then really been really important to his practice. And at the same time, I had asked him to make the lift ticket for the museum. And so those tickets, they printed about a million tickets a year. They've gone to a different system now. But, he was really awed by that request to do something that, would be seen or produced a million times. And he was really serious in his approach to the responsibility that included. And he thought, what would I want to say to people if I have this chance. So he came up with this text, give more than you take. And it ended up on the lift ticket. And this was a really interesting conversation with the Aspen Skiing Company to talk to them about why they should do this. I had to explain the whole notion of text-based art. I had to explain the notion when they asked if they could copyright this so Vail couldn't use it, that no, they couldn't copyright it because it's art and the artist always owns the copyright to the art. But it was an incredibly transformative experience for their team, and literally changed the lives of some people that were working on this project, because it changed the way their brains functioned and the way they understood the world. And so it was a really incredible project. And Jim has a show right now at the Dallas Museum of Art that's traveling to the Walker Art Center and the Hammer, and it's called Give More Than You Take. And it was interesting because, you know, I went through the business side of this with the ski company, and I said, okay, let's worst case scenario it, right? Like, what's the worst thing that could happen? And I said, all right, the worst thing that could happen is someone hands you $108 and you hand them back a piece of paper that says, give more than you take. So do you guys stand by your product, and do you actually give more than you take? Are you providing an experience for people which is worthy of something that's truly of value? So it's actually become sort of their unofficial motto at the company. So this is a project with Fred Tomaselli. You saw that I worked with him back in 1996, and I decided I wanted to do a retrospective or survey exhibition with Fred because I felt like his work was really misunderstood in the wider art world. I felt like people knew him as the drug artist. And his work is like about so much more than that. I mean, at a certain point in his career, yes, that was one of his mediums. So this show ended up traveling to the Tang and to the Brooklyn Museum. But when I talked with Fred about the show, he said yes right away. And then I said, okay, I'll think about it and come back to you. And I said, what I really want to do is a taxonomic reading of your work. Because if you go into Fred's studio, he has everything cut out and it's all cataloged. This is the flower cabinet divided by color, then divided by species. And his work is very much about that archiving and that categorization down to the minute detail. And I said, what I really want to do is do that to your work. So I'd like to divide it into abstraction, figuration, landscape, still life, using completely conventional art historical terms. And he goes, Heidi, that is a terrible idea. And I said, all right, just, go with me a little bit. And so he let me do it. This is the abstraction area. This is a figuration area also. So anyway, divided it into these categories. This is at the Tang, this is at Brooklyn. So these are the birds, more birds. And turns out that he loved the show so much, and he started making, so basically what had happened was he would make a really complex work, like the figurative works, and then to give himself a break, he would make an abstract work. And so when he had done shows up until this point, they were always chronological. So it was like a little bit of abstraction, a little bit of figuration, a little bit of landscape, whatnot. And so all people then focused on was what the commonality which was the medium. That's why they focused on the drugs. But then when you could pull back and it was put into these different categories, absent of the chronology, then you could see his process and how tight actually what he had done was creatively. So first of all, it was totally a critical success. And then all these collectors that had sort of written off the work because they thought it was one thing, realized how deep the practice was. And then he also changed his working practice because he learned a lot about himself and how he works. So like Doug learned about his process during that show, Fred learned about his process in this show. So then this is a show called Restless Empathy. And this was in various locations around Aspen. So this was an Alora Calzadilla piece. It was called Hope Hippo, and it needed at all times to have someone sitting on it reading the local newspaper of that day. And if you read something that bothered you, then you had to blow this whistle. So throughout the day, people would be blowing the whistle when there was something that they thought was like a social injustice. Then this was a work of Laura Favoretto, which this is a little bit of a unusual image because this was a tent that was spinning, and it was spinning so fast that you couldn't actually see inside of it, and so you were always kind of leaning down and looking around. So it was taking this form that's usually associated with fun, which is like the merry-go-round, and making it slightly dangerous. And then this is a project with Lars Romberg. Hunter S. Thompson, who was an famous American writer, lived in Woody Creek, which is the Aspen area, and he had died right before this show. And so Lars put these benches, 9 benches around Aspen that all have quotes by Hunter S. Thompson, and they were all unattributed, but people who knew Hunter and his work knew that they were his. And we put one at the top of Aspen Mountain. And this is a Frances Stark. She did her first live performance for us as part of the show. I'm going to quickly go through a few more of these. This is the Mama Anderson show. So again, included in a group show at Berkeley and then brought to Aspen. First survey of her work in the US. And then this painting ended up on the lift tickets. And then a Mark Manders show. So when I did the first Mark Manders show, I did it on my own. And so I went through Mark's work on my own, and then I thought, you know what, I'd like to revisit that world, but I'd like to basically go in hand with someone else, because maybe I'll come out differently. So I did this show with Douglas Fogel, who I know was another Anne Lind visitor, and then Peter Ely, who was another Anne Lind visitor, took it at the Walker Arts Center, and then it also traveled, I don't know why it doesn't have the hammer dates on here, but then it also traveled to the Dallas Art Museum. So here you see it at Berkeley. Here you see it at Aspen. Then here you see it at the Walker. And here it is in Dallas. Pedro Reyes, who had done the Recyclone, came back and did a project on the grounds of the new Aspen Art Museum. It was called Copula, and again, interactive, letting people in it. And for our groundbreaking, we redid the Carith Wynne Evans Take Your Desires for Reality, and an Amelie von Wolfen, again, solo project at the Aspen Art Museum. And then this project just is opening this week with Teresita Fernandez on the mountain. So it's a reflective work. So I'd love to share with you just 3 of the exhibitions that are opening in the new Aspen Art Museum. I can do them quickly. I know that I've been talking for a little bit, but I asked Sai Gao Chang to do a project for the Roof Deck Sculpture Garden. And this is a project he did, which is called Cultural Melting Bath, which is on Naoshima Island in Japan. It's literally my favorite place in the world. I always say, if I disappear, look for me there. It is a hot tub filled with essential oils and a bunch of scholars' rocks. So this is a project that he had done at the Guggenheim, which is an interior river. This is a firework piece that he did to honor Anne Darncourt, who was the longtime director at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and this was a memorial firework flower to her. This is a project that he did on the roof deck sculpture garden of the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which was a glass wall simulating the windows in the skyscrapers with a bunch of stuffed birds along the edge here, trying to get people to pay attention to where they are. And then every day at noon, there was a little black cloud explosion that was done. And this was an installation he did in Doha, which was about the immigration from China and the precariousness of leaving by boat. This is a gunpowder drawing that he did as part of a now permanent installation at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. And this is a project in Sevilla where these tortoises are carrying indigenous plants on their back. And we're actually trying to do a version of this project in Aspen, but tortoises have a very particular habitat and environment, and 8,000 feet with quixotic weather is not really meshing, and we just had to send sort of a sad email today, which is the veterinarian's report to Sai. So I'm not sure what's going to happen with that, but he also wants to do this black lightning bolt for our opening. So here, this is a roof deck sculpture garden in the new Aspen Art Museum, looking right at Aspen Mountain. And we will do this for sure. I'm not sure now what will happen in terms of a more interactive or longer lasting object. I asked Jim Hodges to do a piece, This is a text-based piece which will ring the exterior of the building. This is our new building designed by Shigeru Bon, a Japanese architect known for doing museums around the world. This is his first one in the United States, but also for doing humanitarian architecture. Every time there's a human or man-made disaster, he travels there. He's right now in the Philippines. He's been everywhere since being, I think the first one was in Rwanda in 1994. So this says, with liberty and justice for all, which is part of our Pledge of Allegiance. So it's what kids say every morning, you know, for the United States flag. And so I love this idea of opening the building with this notion surrounding it. And then the last project that I'll show you is a show that I wanted to do my whole career, which is an Yves Klein, David Hammond show. So it's pairing the anthropometries of Yves Klein with the body prints of David Hammond's, and the fire paintings of Yves Klein, with the basketball drawings of David Hammond's, and the monochromes of Yves Klein, with the Kool-Aid drawings of David Hammond's, and pairing sculptures made out of everyday materials, so the Blue Rain, with the tire tread of Hammond's, the speakers made out of bottle caps by Hammond's, and then the performances, Leap into the Void, with the selling of the snowballs on the street by Hammond's. And that's the end. So.